In this lecture module, we'll pivot away from empirical studies of memory and focus our attention on the ascendance of behaviorism to become the dominant psychological school in the United States. We'll begin by discussing Ivan Pavlov and his discovery of conditional reflexes, as he calls them. We'll walk through the mechanics of classical conditioning, and then we'll look at the first strong advocate of behaviorism in psychology, the methodological behaviorist John Watson. We'll jump slightly out of historical order and turn our attention next to operant conditioning and the radical behaviorism of B.F. Skinner. We'll end the lecture by focusing on the drive theory of Clark Leonard Hull, followed by the purposive behaviorism of Edward Chance Tolman. Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist who was studying digestion primarily in dogs, is the person who's generally credited with the original discovery of classical conditioning. He began noticing the phenomenon in the 1890s in his studies on digestion. It's not mentioned in any of the works or speeches of he or his lab until about 1899, when it's presented in an oral paper and then published by an associate, at least one account, in 1903. Pavlov himself doesn't mention it until his Nobel Prize speech for his work in digestion in 1904, and doesn't actually publish his account until quite late, 1927. Classical conditioning works through associations, and specifically through pairing an innate association with a novel stimulus. So in order to create a new classically conditioned association, you pair an innate stimulus. And here I've chosen the stimulus of a cat, which innately elicits fear behavior in rats in an unconditioned fashion. You pair that unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned stimulus, with some other stimulus that the animal or person has no strong association with prior to the pairings. The unconditioned stimulus will continue to elicit the unconditioned response when paired with the conditioned stimulus. After numerous pairings, you begin to see the increased likelihood that the conditioned stimulus by itself will elicit the original unconditioned response, now termed the conditioned response, since it's evoked by the conditioned stimulus. So both Pavlov and Thorndike discovered that by pairing unconditioned stimulus with conditioned stimulus in a series of trials, you can increase the probability of the subject eliciting the response when presented with the conditioned stimulus alone. In his work, Pavlov refers to the effect as conditioned reflexes, and his work is done with dogs in his study in digestion, in which he happened to notice that the dogs in his laboratory begin to salivate, which they would normally do in the presence of food, but they were salivating independent of the food being there, and he eventually realized that it was because the person who brought in the food was there. In addition to classical conditioning, Pavlov also discovered and studied what are called extinction and spontaneous recovery. Extinction occurs when one presents only the conditioned stimulus, eliciting the now conditioned response over a period of trials. As you continue to do this, the likelihood that the conditioned response, that fear response in our example, gets elicited by the conditioned stimulus alone will decrease with each presentation until eventually the conditioned stimulus, that bell, no longer triggers the fear response. At that point, extinction occurs. While it might seem as if once extinction occurs, the connection between conditioned stimulus and conditioned response has been completely terminated and will no longer recur. However, what Pavlov discovered was that even after extinction, one can sometimes present a conditioned stimulus after a period of time has elapsed, and the subject will again elicit a conditioned response. Pavlov calls this phenomenon spontaneous recovery. In the next lecture module, we'll see how a young American psychologist, John Watson, takes Pavlov's discovery, even before he had published his results, and turns it into a paradigmatic case around which he hopes to organize a school of psychology.